the idea of this is to go ahead and live stream it, record it, and then it becomes a digital record. So each of these podcasts over time, over the year, will be pieces of information where people who sign up or subscribe to the what I call the Renaissance Leader membership program can go back in and look at these over. And I found that if you go back and look at videos or educational videos, and I do this also with other things I look at from an educational perspective, that sometimes I get information I didn't get for the first time or the second time I go through those. So if you run into a problem as a leader down the road and you struggle with what you're thinking about you're going to do, you have some resources that you can come back into the membership account and pull this video back up and look at it again. And maybe it'll give you some insights about what you might do to solve your problem. In addition, you can come back and add comments on a regular basis about what works, what doesn't work, and what we need to do to add to the program and make it more effective as we go along. So all of that stuff is happening. So we want to try to put this program together in a way that serves and is beneficial for people and will allow them to be able to have it as a resource, as well as an opportunity to talk to professionals that can help answer your questions or dialogue through a particular situation. So this particular process is where you have an opportunity to come in and create a situation or talk about a situation you have, and we can dialogue about it. And it's very much like getting consulting or coaching or mentorship as part of the process. So I've found that the subscriber method, once it catches on, hopefully, is a fairly inexpensive way for people who can't afford the consulting fee that we charge people periodically to do that kind of stuff. So it's a way to help folks get a little grip and a little heads up on how to improve what they're running into. So today, like I said, oh, by the way, our February um, 13th show is going to be on positive intelligence. As you follow me at all, or read my book at all, then you're aware that that is one of the primary pillars that underpins my leadership paradigm and leadership development paradigm change that is necessary for us to develop leaders in the future who have uh, the knowledge, the skill, the flexibility, the clairvoyance to handle the many complicated and difficult things that are coming down the pike for leaders and leadership. So you won't want to miss that one. Dr. Brian Grossman has just completed the Positive Intelligence program, and he does the seminars or webinars or however they do those for corporations. And so we're going to talk to him about uh, that program, what's involved in that, so you can kind of see what he does, but also how some of that might relate to leadership development in the future and the importance of leadership development in the future. So stay tuned for that coming up February 13th, I think, and it's at 8 p.m. in the evening also. So what I want to talk about this evening, I think, is the archetype. I'd like to go back and touch on that just a little bit. Uh, this is the archetype. It is the GDI, gender dynamic archetype, index archetype, and it really has two basic dimensions to it: the continuums of masculinity and femininity, and there's behaviors associated with that. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then you have the male and the female aspects about it that allow us to show some of the variance in terms of interaction, accountability, and responsibility throughout organizations, which I think is really an interesting point to talk about because well over 50%, not well over, somewhere close to a little over 50%, 55, 58% of the people in the workforce out there are women. So the question becomes have we applied, given the history that we have, the many thousands of years of history, this just isn't current history. I mean, this is a prominence we've been fighting for thousands of years. The what I told Dr. Crawford was like swimming up a rapids, upstream on a rapids, trying to change this concept of the role of women relative to the business world and leadership in particular. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So that's sort of the dynamics here. I think what I'd like to do first is kind of maybe refresh your memory about what each one of these quadrants represents in the gender dynamic index. And I think the best way to do that is a segment that I pulled out where Dr. Crawford responded.
Yes, well, let's explain to everybody watching and listening. The emotional intelligence is basically, if you looked at that value cycle, emotional intelligence, our ability to understand that we are in charge of our own life. So emotional intelligence teaches us empathy is good, compassion is good, kindness. That flow of the music, like the Coca-Cola song, we want to help the world to sing in perfect harmony. The challenge is, how do we create harmony when we're all different? So emotional intelligence is a personal endeavor to understand how we should live our emotions and treat people with respect and trust and build that value creation cycle. But the key to the use of these gender dynamic archetypes is that we are all different, but we're not so different that we can't value some similarities. So what I started looking at is, who was I as a woman? How was I different to another woman? I knew I was different to men. How could I be understanding of different types of men? And interesting enough, I had two brothers and a sister, and we're all one of each of these archetypes. So I started looking at myself and I thought, right, I understand women are more relational, men are more task focused. But if we look at the difference between women and other women, I could tell that I was a more logical, what I would call masculine minded woman to a very feminine minded sister of my own sister and my other girlfriends, who was naturally more nurturing and more feelings oriented. So if you look at the picture on the left, where I've got four faces facing you, notice that the two men on the left are the two women on the right. That of the two men, the top left man is looking very direct. He's very much an action man. And you can see the description of him on the chart on the right. So he's my ruler. He's a very direct, masculine-minded male. He's physically quite angular and solidly grounded. He loves action. He can be a very sensitive man for sure, but he really loves action. He's seeking solutions. And then there are other men who are much more internal. They look into the synergy around people. They care about people. And notice that that character is looking away slightly. He's got a more gentle approach to life. He will tend to ask, why are we doing things? Whereas the ruler will say, what are we going to do next? And when are we going to get it done? So when I looked at the men, I could see them very obviously that the ruler was one of the main instigators of the male world that we live in. And the servant leader, somebody like Nelson Mandela, the more gentle gentleman, he often got hounded by the ruler saying, gosh, you've got to be more manly. But we were moving into a world where the philosopher, who is the guy on the left bottom, who loves people, he loves synergy. He's the one at the table who is saying, is everybody okay? What's going on here? How are we feeling? Now, with the women, the the lady at the top who's looking directly at you, that's myself, magician, and was always very logical. And the logic comes out in ideas. The magician loves to have ideas, loves to collaborate in a very, what I would call a very eclectic way. Whereas if you notice the woman who's at the bottom right, she again is looking away slightly. She's got a softness about her, which is the feminine energy that comes into women. Now, remember, this is nothing to do with sexual preferences. This is purely based on our natural reactive behavior. So the sovereign, who is the lady bottom right, she's much more about feelings and community, and will want to be the queen of her castle. She wants to gather everybody together. Whereas the magician is a bit of a tough character in a way. She's got a masculine energy within her female frame, and she's very much ideas focused. She's looking directly. Now, these four characters are based on some Jungian psychology and my own research over 30 years. And I can tell you absolutely that these four characters exist. It doesn't mean that every ruler is the same as each other, but the ruler is the one we need making decisions and getting action. Not all magicians are the same, but they're the bosses who are probably quite dominant and are sometimes a bit fearsome. The sovereign, the bottom right, she's the one who's very nurturing. She likes to get all the details right. She's a great one for compliance. And the philosopher is the one who we really want to have as our HR director. He's the one who really cares about people. And these are not personalities, these are reactive characteristics so that we can understand A, when things go wrong, and B, when they go right. And if we want harmony, imagine those four characters are different parts of the orchestra. Well, we want to know how to play the orchestra together, how to be the conductor. And that's where the magical conversations will come in, because we can't hold on to judgments that we've had in the past about how men should be or how women should be, what's right and what's wrong. It's about accepting all the instruments into the orchestra and looking for their best characteristics. So when you get these four characters around the table, and I tell you one thing I would do, Vic, I would change every square table in the world for a round table. That way we could get much more synergy flowing. But we have to understand there's different reactive behavior styles. And that's where it fits in with being high in your emotional intelligence, because when you have very good emotional intelligence, you can accept the differences around the table, and you're more likely to listen and to be able to contribute without contradicting other people. So if you think of where dissonance comes from, where, if you like, disharmony, disruptive behavior, it usually comes when people only see the world one way. That's their way. And then we've got problems because every meeting we have, there's more than often likely to be diverse people around the table. So that's a starting point to understanding these four characters, two men, two women.
So, what we find out uh, from this process that she described is that uh, these archetypes represent really a means for communication, a means for identifying for us the behaviors so that we can kind of recognize them within ourselves first and then recognize them within others. And that helps us to be able to recognize any disharmony that Dr. Crawford aptly represented there. And because when someone has a directive approach and they don't engage others involved in that approach, that is where conflict tends to arise, and things begin to fall apart and organizations begin to struggle. It's oftentimes the point at which people used to call and say, "Can you come in and take a look at this and see what you can do to help us out here?" So it's important. These archetypes are important from that standpoint. But I also think it's important that you tend to understand um, how they come about, how they came about, and she mentioned Carl Jung's theory as part of this, and that is true. It's not all of what she put together, but it has some underpinning for it that sort of reinforces archetypes, kind of where archetypes were evolved. And so I thought it might be helpful to sort of understand uh, how archetypes play. What is it they do that tends uh, to be useful for us when we're trying to help people understand something or trying to get them to see a particular perspective or to see things a particular way. And it goes back to when psychology started becoming prevalent when dealing with people, and particularly when dealing with people in business and those environments. And Carl Jung was of the same era as Sigmund Freud, and they were doing a lot of the research at that time in psychology. And both of them pretty much had somewhat the same similar perspective that within your mind you had two things happening. One of them was your conscious mind. This is that point at which your senses and everything are making you aware of what you're seeing and hearing and what's going on around you, what you're taking in, what you're saying. All of those kinds of things are at play in your conscious world. But there's also a part of your mind that is called the unconscious world. Some people call it subconscious, but it's an unconscious environment where things you've seen or heard uh, you have forgotten about, or maybe you've even repressed them because they were harmful or it made you fearful or something along that line. And so those laid within the realm of uh, the unconscious mind. And so you were going about your business and you're behaving normally and your conscious mind is alert. You're working and you're talking and you're discussing your dialogue and you're doing everything that your mind allows you to do from a conscious state. You're aware of what's going on. Similarly, at the same time, what Freud and Jung both thought was that there is the unconscious stuff that you've accumulated over your life that you've forgotten about. It says here, all the information experiences of an individual's lifetime that have been forgotten or repressed, but continue to influence their behavior and attitudes on an unconscious level. So while you're thinking about this and you're talking about something on an unconscious level, on a conscious level, your unconscious part of your brain brings up a thought that is relative to that or relates to that, and it'll input it into your conscious being. And you may be aware that this is happening. You might say, "Oh, I remember that," or you may not be aware that the unconscious puts it into your realm and you use it as part of your process. I like to think of that as the deja vu thing, where you're you're in the middle of doing something, you're conscious, and you go, man, this feels like I've done this before. What where this is just like really strange. That's your unconscious mind putting into your conscious realm those pieces of information that you didn't recall, you didn't ask for it. It is something that's done automatically for you, so to speak, in the conscious mind. So that's going on, and and both Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud believed that these two concepts were both pretty much happening. Where they differed and actually created a rift or separation between them is uh, Carl Jung began to believe that there were two separate components of the unconscious mind. There was what he called a personal unconsciousness, which was those elements that as you your conscious was perceiving them, but you immediately threw them into the unconscious mind as irrelevant or whatever, and forgot about them, but were very readily and easily infused into your conscious world by your unconscious mind at some point in some way. Sometimes maybe something you said or you thought stimulated that, or maybe the unconscious just created that and put it into your thought process without your recalling it or without your thought of wondering, uh, let's see, can I remember that? That kind of thing. It just comes up. And that was the personal unconsciousness. And what Jung believed is that those were kind of categorized into different areas within the unconscious mind, the personal unconscious mind. And and Carl Jung didn't believe that. He just believed you had the unconscious mind and the conscious mind, and they had big arguments and debates over it, and it went through. But then the other aspect of Carl Jung's philosophy was that there was what's called a collective consciousness. Now, the collective consciousness is a little different than a personal consciousness in that it's happening from the time you're born over periods of times, decades and years, by varying different people who seem to be repetitive in your life. It could be your parents, your pastor, your teacher, friends, whoever, who create things within your consciousness that you immediately kind of set aside or put or forget about, and they go into your unconscious realm, but they go into those collective boxes that he was talking about as ongoing, sort of continuing uh, thoughts, and they're often were created from symbols or words or language, but also from symbols like maybe it was a cross, and the cross represented something very humbling or loving or caring or symbolic. And every time you see a cross, or every time you heard about a cross, or every time anything about a cross came into your mind, went through your conscious mind, but then it was dipped into your unconscious mind when you weren't using it anymore, and it was kind of sent to that collective unconsciousness category, and it kept building, and so that kept growing, and the more that happened, the more powerful that unconscious behavior would become, and those could be both positive kinds of unconsciousness, collective unconsciousness realms, or it could be negative. So it might be something that when you saw it on an ongoing basis in some sort of symbolic way, caused you to have anxiety or fear. that popped into you. I mean, you may be going along and see something that is totally irrelevant to what your conscious mind is doing, but clicks with this collective consciousness as some sort of symbolic representation out there, maybe it was a symbol or an image or something like that, and that stirred in your unconscious mind a sense of fear and anxiety, and it caused you to be hesitant or is sort of a protective defensive posture, because the unconscious mind is where the fight or flight syndrome derives from most of the time. So these are things that are going on in your mind as we're talking about archetypes. Archetypes are often created to help you seed in your unconscious mind those behaviors, those things we want you to understand, represent, and recall, hopefully out of the personal unconsciousness of Jung's personal consciousness, almost call on command or ready so that you can use them effectively when you need to be able to use them. So the archetype process, imagery, the symbolism is like you were seeing in Dr. Crawford's symbols represented that. And here's how this is kind of how Jung thought about these two collective, the personal and collective concepts that represent the total unconscious mind. This is what he would describe that as. It says like everything of which I know, but of which I am not at the moment thinking. Everything of which I once was conscious, but have now forgotten. Everything perceived by my senses, but not named by my conscious mind. Everything which momentarily and without paying any attention to it, I feel, think, remember, want, and do all the future things which taking shape in me and will sometime come to consciousness. All this is the content of the unconscious mind. So that's a lot of stuff that is sitting in the unconscious mind. The unconscious mind plays a very, very significant role in how you begin to use things in your life as you go through, particularly in the leadership role where your conscious mind is constantly bombarded by so many things, so many varying things. It's kind of hard to keep track of them. So, what archetypes can do is they can allow you, if we take a look at here, they can allow you to kind of remember that look on that ruler's face. That will be you have seen this now. It is embedded. You may have forgot it immediately after I took it off the screen, but it was embedded in your unconscious mind. At some point, it could be recalled to help you sense or identify some sort of behavior that you happen to be seeing going on by a leader who's in charge, a ruler, someone who is in the middle of dialoguing about what he wants to have happen or she wants to have happen and just pounding away at it and demanding that we go down this path and this is what he wants to see. And you don't see anybody else interjecting or inputting to that. And this ruler is just moving about 100 miles an hour with this idea and this thought process. And no one's raising their hand and saying, but what about this? What would happen if this happened? Or how's that going to impact everybody? Or Have you thought about some alternative issues that might be impacting that? All of those would have come from the philosopher, the sovereign, and the magician that Dr. Crawford was talking about during the dialogue. And if there's a ruler who is created a sense of disharmony or a lack of unity, they usually shut that down immediately. It's like, no, you know, let's move on. That doesn't make sense. Let's move on. So they're not engaging. They're not involved in it, and so it becomes difficult to get different perspectives or different angles on anything from a ruler who is very authoritarian, very strict. And normally they surround themselves with people who will not behave like a philosopher or a sovereign or a magician, who are not logical or people centered or concerning or looking for alternatives. Uh, they will not want someone. The ultimate, really um severe ruler, if you would probably be in the realm of a narcissist. Um, and you can probably think of somebody like that. Uh, now, uh, the other dynamics associated with the archetype is uh, how do you use this to define that? And actually, there are several ways. Some of these systems and processes are actually done by the consultant or designer of the archetype themselves, where you would call them in and they would begin to observe. I mean, maybe you call them in to watch your staff meeting every month for 2 or 3 months. You know, every week, Monday, you have a staff meeting with your executive team, and you're trying to get a handle on what seems to be the unrest in the team, and as a consultant, you could come in and sit in and observe that team. I have That's one of the processes I've used when there is not a formal assessment process. And even when there was a formal assessment process, a lot of the times I would do that anyway, where you simply sit down and observe the interaction of each of the people in the room with each other and that leader who happens to be a severe ruler, a really strict ruler. And to be able to do that uh, uh, means that you have to sort of assimilate and understand some of the words, some of the language, some of the nonverbal cues, some of the interpersonal interaction cues. This is why I'm so big about interpersonal communication is such an important tool for a leader or a coach or a mentor or consultant to have and be not just have and understand, but be really, really proficient at it, which we don't have a lot of it going on out there. But anyway, in that organization, when you're observing like that, you've got to be able to document. And what happens is the archetype allows you to look at the various characteristics and observe them happening within the behavior. You might have a person who is a sovereign who and the boss is going on during the meeting about doing this and doing that, and you can almost see this person slouching down in their chair and wincing every time the boss says something that they perceive is going to be uncomfortable and harmful to the organizational staff, the employees of that organization. I've seen that happen in staff meetings, and it's hard to watch, but it's pretty easy to document, because you're actually literally documenting the behaviors, the concrete, observable behaviors that you can see because you have the definition in this archetype. Dr. Crawford gave you the definition of that sovereign, what she's going to look like, what she's probably going to say. You can relate to that definition really easy. And you can document those, either writing down what she says or noting her behaviors, her actions, her nonverbal cues, etc. It's one of the dilemmas that social media and remote work creates. In terms of the interaction. If you're doing audio conferences, you can't always clearly, concisely pick up on the behaviors because you can't see them. You can see the inconsistencies, or what we call incongruency, in communication when something is said, but their uh, body language, their what we call kinesics, the facial features, the body language, the posture, the eye movements, gestures, scrunching up and kind of falling back like this and going, I don't know. That kind that when you see that happening, you can actually see that happening when you're observing people in meetings. And when you take note of that, it's something you can go back to the leader with and begin to dialogue. How do you feel your people were responding to this statement that you made? And you would have documented the statement that you saw that behavior reaction to. You say, I noticed they said this. When you said this, there seemed to be some uncertainty in the group. Did you notice that? And they may say no, because they're blowing over it. It is not in their behavior to take a second and observe, because they again, because they are the ruler, they're so focused on getting their point across and getting that particular point across that they lose sight of the behaviors of the other members of the team. And so these are things that, as a leader, you want to become aware of. You want to become aware of, and it's like you want to observe these frequently enough, become familiar with them enough that they get, when you're in the middle of your uh, uh, part of your dialogue, and it's real. If we go back to this, if you're into your consciousness, if you're conscious of what's going on around you, you're in that consciousness, and you notice these behaviors enough, when through your senses, through your sight, through your hearing, uh, you notice these senses, and you log them. You kind of log them in that collective unconsciousness, and you keep pushing them in there, and maybe you'll forget about them later in the day, and then when you come back, uh, you might think about them. You might you get a glass of wine, and you sit back and say, "Let me think about how that meeting went today." And out of that unconscious mind comes rolling these archetype definitions and behaviors that clearly are represented by actions and behaviors that you remember. You remember that you pull out of your unconscious mind and bring them up as conscious memories. And you say to yourself, well, boy, they really were uh, not responding. I mean, it looked like she felt really uncomfortable and upset, but she didn't say anything. Well, there you have the premise for what begins to be the root problem that you can then help them react to. Now, uh, there are a couple of ways you can do this. You can do this by observing and then over time helping the leader to develop the observations. I have had situations, and this is delicate, you have to play it by ear one way or the other, uh, where they have videotaped the conference meetings. Now, the problem with videotaping is it's inhibitive. It creates a sense of uncertainty or fear in certain people. Now, some of it is just the fact of being videotaped. How do I look on videotape? The other part is I'm not so sure I want the documentation of me feeling, looking uncomfortable to my boss. Uh, if you get that kind of agreement, that is one of the most powerful tools to get a leader to see what has actually happened. When you can actually have the, and you don't want to do this secretly, by the way. I want to say that right out front. You do not want to videotape anybody in a meeting that hasn't agreed to being videotaped. But if you can't get that agreement, if you can go past one or two meetings where it seems to be the meeting starts rolling, everybody's a little hesitant for the camera, then they get in the meeting, they forget about the camera. That's really the very exceptionally wonderful moment in time where you capture everything, and you can go back to that later and sit down with them and say, pay attention to what that person is doing, because they are telling you through their body language that they're uncomfortable with what you're saying. And given what we know now and what we talked about, what would be an appropriate behavior for you at this point in time in the meeting? And they might say, well, I should probably stop and say, hey, you look a little uncomfortable with what I'm saying. Can you express what your issues, what your concerns are? And that is the beginning of behavior change. The concrete behavior change you can see happen within a leader who is a rigid ruler who might all of a sudden be saying, hey, there's this person over here. I need to get some insight into what they're saying. If nothing else, to make them feel comfortable about inputting and being honest with me. And then I can disagree with it, but I at least need to hear that. This is stuff that leaders miss constantly, day in and day out in all of their activities. It is singularly the number one thing that when you ask an employee, you're sitting down and say, in fact, I asked this on my hotline question, what one thing would you like to see your leader do better? And it's always, I would love for them to communicate with me more effectively. And I go, well, what do you mean by communication? Well, they're never around, or when they talk to me, they always interrupt me, or they really get definitive about it. They get very clear and concise about it being an interpersonal communication process, because it's kind of not our fault in the world. Interpersonal communication is something that, in fact, is probably the biggest on the job training uh, system in the world, because most people learn how to communicate from people who are their influencers, which are parents and friends and brothers, sisters, and other people they talk to. They don't talk with someone like myself who's trained specifically in what happens when I create a message. When I first want you to hear my message, believe me, hear me, understand me, and react properly to what I ask you to do, I have to couch that message in a way that you can hear it correctly, that there are no barriers between you and I that interfere with that, whether that's language, whether that's culture, whatever. All of those things are encompassed in just creating the message before you even talk to the person. How much do you know about this person so that when you present it, they're going to want to listen to you because they have to want to listen to you. You can't force them to listen to you. They may stand there and look at you and never hear a word you say, and you'll never know it. You'll never know it if you don't take into consideration learning what happens when you're talking with someone. Because you're just lost. You have no idea what they're thinking. And I run into that so much when bosses and leaders say to me, "Why explain this clearly? I have no idea why the hell they didn't do that." Well, no, you didn't. You didn't explain it clearly. You explained it clearly from what you thought you said, but you didn't ensure that you said it in a manner that they could hear it and accept it. Which brings me to one of those axioms that I teach when I teach interpersonal communication is the meaning of the message. Catch this, the meaning of the message you send is always in the mind of the receiver, not your mind. It's always in the mind of the receiver. If you wanted your message, the way you were thinking about it, to be heard the same way in this other person's mind, you have to know enough about that person to put it in terms that they relate to and accept and agree upon, and now they hear it the way you meant it. If you don't do that, then we're into the what everybody teaches feedback. You got to actively listen for feedback. You probably actively listen to 5% of what you hear every day in your life. Otherwise, you'd be going nuts. Uh, what is more critical is you need to be able to say what you mean in a manner that the other person hears it, understands it, interprets it correctly, and chooses to accept it. Then you don't need feedback. It's done. The message is done. What happens is you watch them do it, or they go out and they perform effectively. But if you don't get that message across correctly, if there's barriers in the way, whether they be physical or internal barriers or external barriers, culture, uh, educational differences, language, lack of nonverbal communication, visibility, on the phone, doing it, text messaging, whatever. All of those things are barriers to you getting that message across. Now, what archetypes do is they allow you to clearly define a characteristic and then be able to look, observe, and apply that characteristic, attach it to a result, and dialogue that result and go through the dialogue necessary to clarify it, correct it so that the next time you do it, it works the way you want it to work. The person says, "But boss, if you've got a moment, I'd like to kind of explain something that could happen." And if that boss has been responsive to the development, they'll they'll stop, they'll listen, and they'll take the person's information under advisement. If it's something they think they need to talk to them that they feel they're wrong, they'll probably do that later in private conversation in a way that is growth oriented, development oriented, and not critical or judging. What I found is important about archetypes is it allows this language. It allows a means to be able to discuss these principles. And so there's so many different types. Like I said, and within the uh, Carl Jung perspective, one of the archetypes that came out of that's very popular today is the MBTI personality measurement. You know, you're either an INTJ or an ESTJ or an INTP, and that each one of those letters represents a characteristic of your behavior. And it helps you when you're a leader and you're trying to identify all these different types of people around you. It's sort of a shorthand for you to be able to identify how you need to react to one person versus another. Same is true. Now, with this archetype we're talking about here, specifically, we're saying there's some things that are literally different that we can't change about males and females. Some of it's biological, some of it is in fact emotional, and the differences are very powerful, and they can be used very effectively if we recognize them, understand them, and know how to integrate them effectively using these archetypes to do that. So archetypes, whatever ones you choose to use, whether it's this one for optimizing females and maximizing their effectiveness in the organization, they help it to overcome so many of the issues that organizations deal with, is one aspect of that that's going to lend not just to the organization, it's going to lend to the harmony of men and women connecting more effectively. Okay, so that's important. But if you use the MBTI, it's how to cope with your motivation, whether you're intrinsically motivated or extrinsically motivated. You could use the MBTI for that. If you were operating in a team and you wanted to know the preference for the various team members. You know, some people like to be innovative, creative, come up with all the ideas. Other people want nothing to do with that. They just simply lay the stuff down in front of me. I'll organize it and put it in place and get it out for you. The various team members have these various perspectives and preferences that come by looking at these. And there's an instrument out there called What Makes a Team Tick. And that measures that, puts it in a spidergram, and you kind of know out of your group which people like to do what, and it's easier to cope with those individuals and what they can contribute to the team when you have that information in front of you. So there's DDI, there's the conflict modes instrument, Kilman's mode instruments. There's a variety of archetypes out there, all of them premised off this idea that it helps us to be able to put into our unconscious mind imprinted images and thought processes that we can draw on later that help us to stay structured and organized in a more effective way. I've used it for years. It's really extremely helpful as a consultant. What happens is leaders don't have the education around this. Uh, they'll receive, for example, somebody will say this is a good tool for you to have, but the GDI is a good tool to have, the MBTI is a good tool to have, the what makes a team tick is a good tool to have. You can learn about these things, but unless you understand how that's working for you, how that works, what it makes it happen, what is the underpinning of that, then how do I personally my individual, how do I tend to handle that kind of stuff? Which is where the positive intelligence stuff is going to come in, by the way. Who am I? How do I handle that? How can I then take that information and assimilate it, you know, get it into, understand it, hear it, learn it, and be able to know I understand it, but then internalize it, how's that work for me? How would I apply that versus, say, these other leaders that are around that are what are different than I am, that might apply it differently. And then once I understand that, how can I personalize it so that when I go down and talk to people who deal with me day in and day out, I don't come across as, hey, what's happened to you? Or you present something that you normally don't do, and it comes across insincere, and employees begin to wonder about you, and they begin to lack the trust in you. So these are things that, as a leader, it's important for you to grasp a hold of and talk about and learn as you go along, so that when you run across something like the GDI archetype, you can bring someone in like Dr. Crawford in the beginning, and spend the time to inoculate your organization. The same way you would inoculate against a virus out there, you want to get this into one person, two people, 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people. You want to get this educational dynamic about gender archetypes into everybody in the organization. And you start with her helping you understand the dynamics behind all of this, and how you as a leader can take and personalize that information, and then go down and help other people, train other people to begin to inoculate your whole organization with JDI archetypes, or GDI archetypes, I'm sorry. And consequently, then your organization begins to respond. And the only thing that would disrupt that is a change in leadership, or a change in approach, something that is outside of your control externally that could interrupt that. But the power of having that down throughout the organization is it's extremely hard to disrupt something like this, um, with a event change. Usually you'll figure out how to overcome that. The organization will help you overcome that if you've done that. Unfortunately, a lot of times what happens is executives bring in a consultant, they'll bring in a trainer, they'll bring in a group, they'll do it at a small, you know, short, limited time parameter thing, and then it goes away, and basically nothing significantly changes from that. Uh, this is why I always recommend people start with the beginning, slow, a department at a time or something. People will see the success of that. Then they're going to want the inoculation of the GDI archetype in their department. Then you got two departments talking about it, spreading the word. Then you got three departments, and you got the whole damn company, and then you got the whole organization, including the executive team, engaged in it. And I find that's the most powerful way to infuse something like the GDI archetypes. Okay, I'm going to let you go for the evening because we've been at it for about an hour, and hopefully this, not only have you learned something about the more about the archetype, but you've learned a little bit about how that plays out, and the underpinning, the theory behind why it works so well. Carl Jung was this concept of the use of unconsciousness and the categorization of unconsciousness and its ability to be recalled because of that, even without you wanting to recall it, it'll pop up periodically. You'll see it, you'll be watching something, you go, yeah, look at that. And you didn't intend for it to come up, it just comes up, it's there. That's what you want. You want that capacity and that knowledge to be able to work for you that way. And so hopefully that'll be helpful. As a leader, get it in, learn it, and get your organization. I encourage every executive to encourage this. If it starts at the executive level, it will spread through the organization much faster. It's kind of hard to get them to go that route initially. I've found that to be just part of the male architect problem. but if you have a perhaps a female executive who is the ruler, but rules more from a magic perspective or a philosopher perspective, you might see opportunities to bring these in different ways. Which, by the way, if you run into this male, if you happen to be a department head, you run into this strong male, masculine, highly masculine, authoritarian, directive, uh, ruler approach. Uh, you might find somebody in the organization like these others who are more open to it, and that's where you want to try to begin your process. So hope that's been helpful. My name is Victor Vogel. I'll see you next month at the next Q&A after we have the positive intelligence, February 13th, 8 p.m. in the evening. Uh, be with us. You're going to enjoy that hour or so discussing positive intelligence and its impact on leadership. Till next time, I'm Vic Vogel.